Welcome back to Open Line tonight. I'm Carrie Sharp. Thank you for joining us. Tonight we are talking about the transgender bills that are making their way through the state legislature. Dahron Johnson from the Tennessee Equality Project is my guest tonight, and we haven't done this yet, so I want to get into the meat of the two bills that we have been keeping a very close eye on, where they stand, what they are. Feel free to chime in because you've been there on the floor testifying yourself about this. The first one, which actually goes before the House Finance Committee tomorrow but has been signed off by the Senate, expands the current law from prohibiting transgender females from participating in female sports at the middle and high school level, expands it to the collegiate and intramural level.
That's correct. So collegiate sports, whether they're between schools or intramural sports, which are traditionally within the institution, and it would be both public and private institutions as well too.
That's interesting. And I do want to note that it's an expansion of the current law.
That's correct.
This is something that we tackled, I think, the last legislative session. So it's moving on and expanding. The second one, which is headed to the governor right now, it's awaiting his signature, would actually fine school districts that do not prohibit transgender students from participating in sports.
And I think that the really concerning thing about that bill is that it risks school districts, LEAs, from losing funds for simply trying to be more inclusive, for trying to be less discriminatory, right? So that if a school district decides that for the purposes of sport in their education system, which again is a component of the education program that any district feels best serves their students. If that district decides, for example, that they feel a team which includes transgender female athletes would best serve those education and sporting interests, then this legislation would expand on the legislation that was passed last year prohibiting transgender female participation in middle and high school levels, and direct the Department of Education to withhold funds from districts that are trying to practice this broader, less discriminatory, more inclusive sporting environment for their students.
And this comes at a time when the federal government has just said, if districts do this, participate in this type of discrimination, we will withhold federal funds from the state.
Exactly. At the end of March, I think it was on the 31st of March, a letter came out from the Department of Justice that said, we consider discrimination against transgender folks as a type of discrimination, and that states found to be acting in discriminatory ways risk federal funding. And certainly a lot of dollars for our schools not only come from the states to all the individual districts, but then also from the Fed into our states' coffers that then gets dispersed out into the various districts. And so we risk doubly a school district that withholds a school district that allows transgender participation risks funding from the state under the legislation that's about to be signed. But under the legislation that's about to be signed, we're also risking federal dollars as well. So it creates a really challenging situation for all of our students, not just the transgender females students, but all of our students, because as we all know, our schools could use every dollar and then some. So this is a really worrisome development that the state is trying to implement at this point.
I find it particularly interesting that this new legislation that's working its way through this legislative session particularly focuses just on transgender females. Whereas past legislation has actually brought a civil suit, I think it's a civil suit, by a transgender male who wants to compete on the boys golf team, and he's being banned from doing so. But this legislation just focusing on transgender women. What's your thought?
Well, I mean, that's the question that begs the question, doesn't it? I think that while before, for example, the example of the swimmer Leah Thomas was brought up, and that's being used as her involvement is being used as a lightning rod for discussion on these issues and for bringing forward this type of legislation. I think that it speaks to a much broader range of legislation that is aimed in pushing folks who are anywhere in that sort of communities collected under the LGBTQ letters, pushing them out of the public square, pushing them out of the civic sphere and into the margins, into the periphery, even more than they often already are, right? So that, for example, even setting aside the sports legislation that we've been discussing. Tennessee was trying to pass its own version of don't say gay laws. Well, how then does my son talk about his family in class without bringing up the different structure of his family? How does a civics class talk about current issues when the issues that are before our legislature are these very issues of difference? And so I think that while it's easy to focus on one athlete in one event, if we take a step back, we see that this is really part of a much broader push that we're seeing that expands it not just from middle school and high school to post-secondary education, but as part of this even broader sweep that's meant to push us out of our doctor's offices, that's meant to marginalize us in conversations in the civic square, that's meant to keep us out of the history books and classrooms, as well as keep us off of the sports fields as well. And the disappearance of trans masculine folks and trans males speaks, I think, even to some larger issues about the way that a variety of folks are viewed, or in this case, not viewed at all, by our legislators and by society in general. And that's just as worrisome, right? There's a lot of focus on people like me,
right?
But it's even more worrying when you disappear a whole community because you haven't even addressed them. Not that I want anybody else.
That's kind of a double-edged sword.
Not that I want anybody else to be banned.
Yeah.
But this is a historic absence that's just being perpetuated in this legislation in yet another fashion. There are a variety of folks in the world. That's what makes this world interesting and wonderful, tougher to navigate sometimes, but we gain the most when we allow the most people in, whether that's whether that's in a sporting arena or in a classroom or in a legislature or a congregation or anywhere else.
I appreciate hearing your story. I want to hear more about it. I'm just fascinated by it. I do want to hear more, but we have to take a quick break.
Sure.
And again, I want to remind you, this is OpenLine. This is your chance to call in, have this conversation with us, 615-737+. We're coming right back.